I'm a cultural anthropologist, by the way. I should say something at Boston University. My own background in that, I like to do interdisciplinary work, though. I've been getting into the interdisciplinary work. So I'm sure we have an interdisciplinary audience here. So I look forward to hearing other people's perspectives also. So this isn't, a hugely comprehensive presentation on all the taboos. I'm picking a few of them here. And I'm sure others will have others to say. So my point here in social problems, social science research on social problems, it is beset by biases. So this is just a summary of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about why the biases are there. What are they driven by? What are some of the examples? What are some of the methods that people use in their research that actually kind of form their biases? And then at the end, I'll look at some of the balanced approaches and the interdisciplinary approaches, the good work that people are actually doing on social problems that are relatively balanced. So why, first of all, quickly, why do we have these biases and taboos? Anthropologically, we're narrative-driven creatures. We love stories of good and evil. We seek meaning. We see that in our culture all over. We see that also in social science research. We're supposed to be objective scientists, but of course, I think our narrative-driven nature kind of even drives a lot of the objective research. I don't think any of us can escape that, but I think some of us are more influenced by that than others. We're also social creatures. We love to join in with others in common causes. So this is where we get all the political groupism, things like cancel culture, the extremes. People gather together around similar beliefs. And so that's part of the polarization, of course, that we have in our society, not only in academia, but in general. So what are the stories? What are the narratives that's driving a lot of social science research? Well, what I focus on a lot is the structures, people talking about systemic things and the structures, and the big story, the narrative that's told that underlies a lot of the social science research. And there's, of course, a partial truth to it, but it's not the whole truth. Structures dominate us and oppress people. That's kind of the assumption that a lot of people carry forward into their research. So therefore, we really shouldn't look at what people do, lest we blame the victim in some way. So you hear that, don't blame the victim. We can't really look at what people are doing. We need to look at the structures. So in general, structures are bad things that oppress us. People are good. That's kind of an American thing, right? We're very individualistic. Other cultures necessarily don't have this negative view of structures, of social structure, but we're individualists and we like to think that people are good. Of course, the reality is a lot more complicated than that, but that's just the relatively simplistic narrative that drives. So therefore, individuals should be held blameless. And I see that in some of the research I do with my wife, we do research on people in poverty through nonprofit agencies, and there's people that are critical of that work. So they think we shouldn't really focus on individuals because it's not their fault, and even kind of helping them on their everyday spending or everyday practice is really pointless because it's the structures that are the problem, is the assumption. Therefore, there was this example of that is the grit literature that came out, got especially popular a few years ago to show that some people are doing well, some people have more grit than others, and we need to encourage grit. Well, there was a big backlash against that because that was seen as blaming the victim. So, and there was some legitimate criticisms of that grit literature, but again, sometimes people reacted reactionary to that. So if we say that people have agency, let me see, let me click this down here. Sorry, okay. If we say people have agency, they are to blame for their condition, therefore we must blame structures. Likewise, we can't have culture as a causative factor. So people focus on structures, they kind of take out the individual and they take out culture often in a lot of their models and a lot of their discussions. So they end up with a rather simplistic model. So this results in what other scholars have called over-structuralizing or guilt politics. So I have the example there of Australia, the situation of the indigenous there, the Aboriginal populations there. It's a long-standing controversial issue in Australia. There's huge inequalities there between the mainstream European population and the Aboriginals. Australia's gone back and forth on what to do about it. Is it the problem of the structures? Is it colonialism? Is it a cultural issue? They've really been stuck in this for decades now. And some of the people that anthropologists, there's a few anthropologists actually that have called out some of the overly kind of structuralized approaches and said, look, you're over structuralizing the problem. culture is a part of the model. There's cultural differences that we have to understand, that we have to realize. And they've also argued that guilt politics over colonialism, over the domination by the European population of the Aboriginals has also played a role in policies that really ignore what's happening in the culture that you have to, in the culture of the Aboriginal population. So balanced policies are needed there. And they've had that same issue too. You can apply that same thing, I think, to our own situations here in North America. History of all this, leaving the individual, leaving culture out. Long history there. I won't get into it at all. It goes back at least to the 1960s, the culture of poverty arguments that kind of, you know, was not a good argument. It's still thrown out a lot. Oh, it's culture. It's a culture of poverty argument. You can't use that. I still get that sometimes when I look at cultural factors from reviewers and things like that. You're familiar with the Moynihan report on the African-American family back in the 60s, huge backlash against that at the time. And at that point, culture became a taboo and has only gingerly come back, but often only in a weak form. So it's still a very sensitive issue, and it is something you do need to handle with care, but it should be included in the model, is my point. So this ends, all the above means we end up with simplistic theories of social problems in the public discourse. Okay, so what are some of the specific examples here? Okay, so I'm not going to go through these at any length. I'll go through them rather quickly. Inequality and poverty is one of the things I really work on. Inequality and cultural diversity. If you look at the racial wealth inequality literature, the topic of consumption and people's saving habits are almost totally neglected in that. It's kind of an individual behavioral factor that's affected by culture and structure, of course, but people are really leaving that out of the models, and they're saying, look, this is they're saying it's only a structural issue, whereas I think it's a lot more complex than that and comprehensive than that. The education issue too, again, I would argue that, and a lot of people do argue that family contexts are crucial, but in the public discourse on that, in what you see in the New York Times often in editorials, it's structures, and they're leaving out what a lot of some education scholars are saying is really the family context of education that prepares people for school, even before you get to school, really a crucial thing in education. Health disparities, I wrote a blog post about this recently for the Heterodox Academy. Scholars there over-structuralizing the issue, whereas behavioral patterns are important. I'll show a graph on that a little bit later. What you have a lot of the discourse, the New York Times and popular press, and in some of the academic work, certainly too, is only looking at structures simplistically, whereas we need a comprehensive model there. In research on Asian Americans, scholars sometimes attempt to prove that they are disadvantaged and not a model minority. In reality, of course, Asian Americans are doing well. I'm going to call on Art Sakamoto here. He's joined us today. He's a sociologist at Texas A&M who focuses on Asian Americans. Art, I'm going to bring you in a little bit later when we talk about the statistical model, but Art is a specialist in this, and we've worked on that together, so he knows this literature quite well. And then I see that also an influence on religion on social problems. Often religion-sensitive topic, kind of a cultural topic too. People don't really want to talk about that so much. My wife is a social work professor, looks at faith-based nonprofits and what they're doing, and often she sees the religious element as important. So, and I'm sure we have lots of other examples that we will get to in the discussion. So what the result of all this, what ties us all together, is the neglect of behavior and culture in favor of structures in much of the research. Okay, how is this biased? How do we see that in the actual research, in the actual publications? Well, in qualitative research, and I'm a qualitative researcher, and I like qualitative research. I think you can really see things that you can't through quantitative research, but of course, it's relatively easy to bias your narrative, your story. You can be very selective in the stories you tell, in the examples you pick, et cetera, et cetera. There's ways to avoid that, but again, it's easy to kind of slant that in a different direction. But it also happens in quantitative research. And this is where I'm going to call on Art. And he's going to actually do a little promotion for, he's doing an upcoming spotlight on this very issue and how quantitative research has issues and problems and can bias the research through over-controlling and under-controlling for variables. through statistical models, through regression models, in how especially variables, covariables sometimes affect the outcome, but they're also part of the causation. And I won't get into the specifics of it now. We can talk more about it later, but Art, do you want to add anything here right now? Art,
No, I think you're exactly right. Go ahead, you're doing a great job.
okay, we can get into that more in detail in the discussion, but Art is here on call. I can't really talk a lot about the quantitative research in detail, but and he has good research too. And again, I pitch his upcoming spotlight on it if you'd like to hear more about that. Also, assumptions can drive methods, of course, both in quantitative and in qualitative research. People come into it with assumptions, can drive the methods and the outcomes. In addition to that, the choice, of course, of what one studies can be very selective also too. So you get some topics that are very popular, get a lot of research, a lot of studies on it. Other topics that should get more research are avoided because of certain sensitivities. This, by the way, is the potential for over-controlling. I won't talk about this. Art can maybe talk about this later if people want to talk about it. But in the confounding variables below is where you get this distortion sometimes, and you find quantitative research that looks as if it's scientific. They come up with a finding to prove, for instance, that it's structural issues, but then you realize if you look at the model, and Art is good at that, you take it apart and you see that there are issues in their methodology. All right, so now I'm going to get to the comprehensive approaches. 5 minutes left here, good. To social problems. What should we do? What is a good method of understanding social problems like poverty, like inequality, like education, like health disparities, and a number. I think we have to look at all three levels: structures, cultures, and individuals. And this is something I've used in class, so pardon the bad art there, but I've used this for lectures here. So these are the three levels. I think we have to understand all of these things, and especially how they interact. I mean, these aren't three separate things. They overlap. Structural and cultural and individual factors all affect each other. So I have the arrows between them, but these are the things. We have our institutions that in fact do dominate us at times, that do force us into do things. But of course, institutions also allow us to do things too. So cultural, the middle, again, my focus is more on the cultural influences. That's what I look at, but I see especially and more recently trying to understand social problems. I've gotten into the literature that comes out of social development and child development, and that comes out of psychology and social psychology to look at the factors on the bottom. And so some of the individual factors are some of the, the character, ambitions, and priorities, but then also the sensitive area, of course, of brain biology and genetics too. So all of these things affect each other. And there's good work in different areas on genomics and things too, if you want to incorporate how the environment and biology or the brain affect each other. So this, again, there's a lot of research here. I'll have more examples a little bit later. Another look at the levels, a different kind of view of it is, I'd say, a biographical view. My wife does research on biographical sociology is her specialty, life paths. So if you look at it from the family and individual perspective at the bottom, when you're born, that's kind of your main influence. But as you go through your life cycle, as you age, you get influenced by more and more things: cultures, lifestyles, networks, neighborhoods, social class, regional and ethnic variation, and then the structures at the bottom. So let's see here. So you see structures, cultures, and individuals all through this kind of life path here. So these things are factors that will influence outcomes in social problems. Example of premature death. This is more in the health factor. And again, one can debate these percentages. This is one study that came up that says behavioral factors are actually 40% of what causes health outcomes. In this case, premature death. Genetics are 30%. Other studies put genetics as a lower factor. Again, it's how you kind of examine the influence between genetics and the environment. And structural factors are actually here, in this example anyway, smaller, like the healthcare system. Sometimes in the public discussion of healthcare disparities, you find a big focus on the structure, on the healthcare system. In reality, that's not the primary cause of why people are in ill health or why there's premature death. Behavioral factors are the biggest factor there. Okay, so who are some of the researchers that are actually looking at all of these models? There's a sociocultural self-model of behavior by, I believe these are social psychologists here. This is their, I'll just put that up there, Stevens, Marcus, and Freiberg. This is their model of how these things influence each other, the structural conditions, the individual characteristics, how that influences the self, and then how on the right, the outcome in thoughts, feelings, and indeed actions and behaviors. And you see the citation there below for those that are interested in that. And again, I believe this is being recorded also, so you can look back at any of these slides later too. In sociology, I like the work of Orlando Patterson, a sociologist at Harvard. He has a book out a few years ago called The Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. So he's a specialist in African-American context. And his work is not get the attention that it should. I mean, he has done some writing in more popular venues, but a lot of the other sociologists are getting more attention, especially in the issue of race. Here's his interesting model from that book. This is a page from his book on the cultural matrix. I'm not going to go through all of it, but you see all of the various factors. Some of these are structural, some of these are cultural. It doesn't really have the individual so much in here. He's not familiar, I think, with the social development, early childhood development, but you can see it in there with in the middle with the model on parenting and how parenting influences things. He's got cultural factors in there. He's got structural factors in there. He's got racism, discrimination. And then on the right is kind of one of the outcomes, youth unemployment, delinquency, and violence on the right. But then again, the influences go often in two directions. So they're going back why the statistical models are hard really to get accurate because of all these interacting factors. So that's Orlando Patterson's model. Some of the other models here, I think we're almost at 20 minutes, so I'm coming to the end. Just a few of the other critical realism approach, if any of you are familiar with that. Again, does not get a lot of attention in sociology. It's kind of a side area in sociology. Number of scholars in there. Margaret Archer, a British scholar, is one of the leaders in that. She has an interesting three-model approach. Human development work, there's some anthropologists, social psychologists, Thomas Wiesner and others that utilize culture, context, and methods pluralism. They argue early childhood and family context are crucial and that the path is often set before one even gets to school, for instance. So they examine a lot of the different factors. And there are economists like James Heckman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Isabel Sawhill, Melissa Kearney, that are actually bringing all these factors together. Heckman is really focusing on early childhood again. Isabel Sawhill and Melissa Kearney are very good scholars on poverty in general, and they look at these factors in a lot better modes than others. So anyway, this is my final point, my final slide here. Any approach to social problems, I argue, needs to utilize all three levels if you want to be comprehensive. A lot of scholars are going to look at little small pieces of these social problems, and it's not really the expectation that they need to be comprehensive. But if you're making a claim to of what causes a social problem, and if you want to be comprehensive about it, you need to really understand, look at all these three levels, and we just don't see that enough, I think, in the general popular approach to social problems that we see in the literature, and then also in a lot of the scholarly literature too that often gets published. So that's it. I will open it up to discussion.